again, and welcome to the Author Roundup. This special segment of the Book Connection Show showcases emerging indie authors who join us for a discussion of their newly published books. Join us for a conversation with our next guest author. My name is Emma. I will be your host for today's episode. Happy to be here. And this episode, I have self-published author Jackie Cahan. Jackie is the no-nonsense numbers whisperer behind finance and accounting for beginners. Her book that turns financial fog into clarity and confidence, a CFO and real-world turnaround strategist. Jackie translates messy moments into clear and powerful decisions. She's here to show you how knowing your darn numbers changes everything. Hi, Jackie. How are you today? Thanks for being here.
I'm great. Thank you, Emma, and thanks for having me. So
Yeah,
wonderful to be on your
of
podcast.
course. Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit about your book? It just came out last year, correct?
Yeah, it
Okay.
did. And so it's been over 20 years in the making.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
I was asked over 20 years ago to write this book. I was
Okay.
invited by Fortune 100 companies because they knew that they needed to empower every single person in that business with knowledge about their numbers.
Okay.
And I would take it off the shelf throughout my career and I would say, well, maybe you could use this to help. Maybe you could use this book to help understand the story that it's trying to tell you. And so I knew that I had something that I really wanted to put into print that
Mm-hmm.
everyone could use to be empowered with this language.
Okay. And so your subtitle of your book is Know Your Darn Numbers, which is both direct and kind of like cheeky. Why was it important for you to frame, financial literacy in like a fun way?
Thanks, and thanks for recognizing that because
Yeah.
over those last 20 years, I kept saying, do you know your numbers? Do you know your darn numbers? And it isn't just for the accountant to know the numbers, right?
Yeah.
Everyone shares a responsibility in understanding the story that those numbers tell.
Hmm.
And, as I continue to teach and explore what it means to educate people about the language that we use in accounting, it really became evident that everyone should really be able to take that financial responsibility, that really important learning skill, which is knowing your darn numbers. While I talk
Yeah.
a lot about it being more business oriented, it really is for every reader because you have the responsibility to yourself to understand your own darn numbers.
Yeah, yeah. And so your book wasn't originally written as like a traditional accounting text, right?
That's correct.
Right. So why did you write first, or who did you first write it for, and how has its audience evolved over the years?
Such a great question, right? Because I did start over 20 years ago with the Fortune 100 companies. So
Yeah.
large conglomerates, companies like Conagra, companies like Hendrickson Trucking. I had bank clients. I had huge utilities that wanted this book. And I
Hmm.
was like, wow, okay,
Awesome.
they need it. Everyone needs it. And so I refined it over the years because then as my life and my career progressed, I
Hmm.
started to realize that far more people really don't know their darn numbers.
Hmm.
And I worked with a gentleman through one of the. It's not a case in the book, but I was involved with a startup, and the leader of that startup would say to me, "Only report when it's sunny and 70."
Mm.
So yeah, it really that spun me on my
Yeah.
heels because I kept thinking,
Uh,
well, you even need to report more when the skies are overcast and gloomy and quite possibly might be raining or
yeah.
storming. So I really realized that people may take accounting when they're in college. They may get one class. They may even take it in high school, but that doesn't mean that you can actually read that language. And the
Yeah.
minute I started to reframe this as a language class and really being able to understand the nuances of the language, it freed up the ability to craft the stories in the form that I did.
Hmm. And so you said it's been 20 years over the making. So when did you start writing your book, and when did you publish it, like as far as like when did you really want to like publish it with a publisher and get it out in the world?
Yeah. So again, 20 years ago, so it was probably 2005, right before the disaster, right? The first disaster that we had in my financial life. And that was when a lot of these big companies were like, wait, we need to train our employees. We need to arm them with this financial information. We need them to have the language. It isn't just for the accounting teams to come in
Mhm.
and to constantly and consistently report on those numbers.
Yeah.
So it morphed out of my teaching at local community colleges, also at large institutions, but also morphed into this. I would pull it off of the shelf when I would be transit. I've been a CFO for also 30 years. So in all of my roles as that chief financial officer, I would pull the manual. I used to call it a manual. I would pull the manual
Mhm.
off the shelf and I would give it to everyone. I'd make copies of it and say, let's share the common language because
Mhm.
otherwise I can't help you understand the numbers without having a common language.
Yeah.
So recognized I went through a pretty tragic experience, and that's the first case that I write about. I
Mhm.
was the chief financial officer for a single family office. It was one particular gentleman in 2018. He sold his company for $180 million. By 2021, he was broke.
Oh my gosh.
3
What?
years it took for him and his advisors to plow all of that money, all of that financial resource into these esoteric venture capital, non-publicly traded investments. He had 96 investments and he had to file for bankruptcy.
Oh my
And
gosh.
the
That
companies
was
that were
rough.
left ended up filing for bankruptcy. And I joined that particular company in 2022.
Mhm.
So a year after it all sort of had gone down, I uncovered almost all of the fraud.
Mhm.
And I knew that if I couldn't save him financially, he was going to die. And he
Mhm.
died early last year.
Oh.
So just shortly before the publication of this particular book. And it is
Oh.
um, a tragic, tragic story. And
Yeah.
had he known his darn numbers, it wouldn't have been so tragic for his family. He has a wife, he leaves
Yeah.
behind 4 kids. Their
Oh.
whole lives have been turned around by the
So
financial
this.
missteps of his advisors. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you worked with, him and his company, and you worked with startups and distressed companies and middle market businesses. What's the most common financial blind spot that you've seen across all of those, or what's the common one?
Such a great question, right? And even the public, right? Even publicly traded companies. When
Mm-hmm.
you listen to CNBC, it's always about earnings. What are the earnings? What are the earnings per share? And it's
Mm-hmm.
such a common language that most people then go to that income statement. And I would always caution everybody because an income statement is more of accounting gimmickry. And while generally accepted accounting principles enable us to have that sort of wizardry to the financial statement, the cash
Mm-hmm.
flow statement is actually what tells us the truth. So you have a balance sheet that shows the strength of the company. You have a cash flow statement that says, how did they generate cash? Because the only thing that matters at the end of the day is how much cash do they generate. And
Mm-hmm.
so once I started to be able to help people realize that we've got to stay away from the CNBC type of commentary and we need to really be thoughtful about what generates cash inside of that business. What does it mean when they run out of cash, when they need to file for bankruptcy? And how do we use ratios and other sorts of common calculations that will help really describe how that business is performing?
Mm-hmm. And how did you learn all of your expertise and things that, some people, like we discussed, in accounting classes that they take in college, they just don't really get the full scope of what they need to know for a business. So how did you, have all of your wisdom and expertise? How did that come, for
Oh,
you?
it's such a great question. And the best part about this is it really sort of came to me in like the last 6 months while
Mm-hmm.
writing this book. As a young child, I was very precocious and I asked why all the time. And then as our parents got tired of that particular word, right? We all know this as children. Why? Our parents would say what in response to that? Because I said so. So we've been
Mhm.
ingrained since young people to stop asking that question. And
Yeah.
most of it can be off-putting, right? Why? You're challenging someone with that question. And I started to think, right, how do we reframe that? Because we do want to know the answer. We do
Yeah.
want to know why, right? That's the critical thinking skills. And as we're sitting in this age of AI, right, where the machine's going to do a lot of the work for us. And I've said in accounting, I'm so grateful the machine's been learning. And as I write about that in the book and say, you know what, AI's been there, thankfully, because no one should really have to do journal entries. We want to free that human being up to be
Yeah.
that critical thinker, the one who's interpreting what those results mean, asking that question, why? So people
Hmm.
used to call me a unicorn throughout every one of my positions. A unicorn. I was, what does that mean, being a unicorn? Because I would ask why. I wouldn't just take the numbers and say, here they are, do with it what
Yeah.
you will. I would
Hmm.
get into operations. I'd roll my sleeves up. I'd be out there. I'd be making burgers at my startup restaurants. I'd be in there in I was a chief financial officer for a cash in transit business. I would be in the vault trying to understand the movement of the way that that money moved through the system because I
Yeah.
couldn't fix things without answering that question, why? And
Hmm.
I think that that's really served me well. And so while I've had to reframe it from why to how come, that feels a little bit less impressive.
How come?
I still think it's
I
one of the
love
most
that.
important questions that we can ask as we're teaching critical thinking skills. So.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's great. And we mentioned well you mentioned that your book uses real, case studies including bankruptcies and, multi-million dollar collapses. Why do you think stories may be more effective than theory when teaching financial discipline?
Oh gosh, another great question. And I don't know if it's just because I love the stories, truthfully, not
Yeah.
my own stories. I love
Yeah.
storytelling. I
Hmm.
love being able to put all of that color. Numbers are very black and white. They
Hmm.
say this is where we are, this is the measurement, this is the line in the sand. But how do we bring in the feeling to it? So I spent a good part of my career in hospitality, and everything that we did in hospitality was trying to predict how that customer was going to act, right? We needed to know when their birthdays were, when their anniversaries were, because that way we could take care of them in a really, really special, spectacular form and fashion. And so when you get to kind of anticipate through that storytelling, it gives you that really beautiful color and you start to get to anticipate what's actually needed.
Hmm.
Historical information, right? That's all financial statements. It's all
Yeah.
historical. But as we read the story, the news articles, the management discussion and analysis inside and embedded next to those financial statements, you get that beautiful color that helps you formulate maybe your own stories. And quite frankly, we live in a whole world where stories are all that we're asking for. I
Yeah.
mean,
True.
social media is nothing but storytelling, right?
Yeah.
And every person who gets on there is telling an important story. And so I always knew that accounting is very dry. It's very black and white. How do I make sure that it's engaging? And as I engage with people, I hear often, you're not a typical accountant. This is so fun to take your class to hear this from you because you
Mhm.
really understand how to interpret it, but also how to make it interesting to people. And
Yeah.
that's really important, making it interesting.
Yeah, like the relevance, everyone, admires relevance and how does this relate to me and my business? So yeah, I think that's very, very true. Um, so we talked about, bankruptcies and, what happens maybe. So what are some early warning signs that tend to be ignored with like bankruptcies and collapses and things like that?
Yeah, so the first thing is always cash flow, right? We couldn't make our payments to our vendors. Why all of a sudden is it taking us too long to collect from our customers, right? That is the beginning of the breakage of
Mm-hmm.
the strength of that particular business. When they start to get into these hiccups with cash, and which is why the cash flow statement is the most important financial statement anyone reads. Again, you
Mm-hmm.
move aside that income statement, look at that cash flow statement and start to ask the question, where does that cash come from? If they can't
Mm-hmm.
generate cash from their operations and they have to sell stock or they have
Mm.
to sell their assets, that business will be bankrupt really, really
Yeah.
soon. And so it's all this understanding of how actual currency flows, right? And what it
Yeah.
means to move through the system. And so
Yeah.
it's been a beautiful way of being able to articulate that.
Yeah. Is that mainly what a lot of companies do? They start selling their assets and stocks when they're in trouble. They're
Oh,
just they
oh
go to
yeah.
that first.
Oh yeah, it's the
And that's
easiest
not
thing. They
good.
think, look at Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, right? And you can see them getting ready
Yeah.
to file for bankruptcy. They started selling off all of their flagship stores.
Hmm.
Every single beautiful building that housed that store, they started selling off. And then I just read recently that they started selling their floor space. So they no longer stocked
Hmm.
inventory. They just went on what's called consignment. And so they'd have
Mm.
all of these brands that were then renting space inside of Saks Fifth Avenue. And it turned
Hmm.
into just chaos when they stopped
Yeah.
understanding their customer, their luxury customer, who doesn't want to
Yeah.
feel like they're in a mall inside of Saks Fifth
Right.
Avenue, right?
Yeah.
With this brand running it with these different colors and this flow and floor print plan. And then over here, you've got a different brand and it's maybe all wild and crazy. That doesn't work with the luxury customer. And so you could
Yeah.
see those signs flashing really, really bright.
Even with the big companies. Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely. It doesn't matter the size, and it
Yeah.
doesn't even matter if it's a company, right? When we think even about our personal lives, what's the first thing we start to do to generate cash? We start selling our assets. We start
Yeah.
we
That's
start
so
selling our
true.
stocks. Yes, we
Yeah.
think, oh, maybe I'll sell my house and I'll take the equity from there. And it's like, okay, wait, we need to really think about what your balance sheet looks like because if you don't have any assets, you can't generate revenues.
Hmm. Very
You
true.
have to have assets to generate
Yeah.
revenues.
And so for business owners that, feel overwhelmed by financial reports and what's the number one thing or what's the one number they absolutely must understand?
And I just keep going back to cash flow, right?
Cash flow.
Where does the cash come from? Because you can have the greatest revenues, and if you sell it all on account and nobody ever pays you for those revenues, it doesn't
Hmm.
matter. You could have $1 trillion in revenues. If nobody ever pays you, who cares? And
Yeah.
that's the problem with current accounting. Current accounting, and I'm not here to change GAAP. I don't believe that anyone at the AICPA is going to care about what I have to say, other
Hmm.
than we have to keep teaching to the cash flow statement so that
Yeah.
people read that first and then understand because
Yeah.
there's so much that goes into that P&L that
Hmm.
really truly doesn't reflect our cash basis. And so when we strip all of that out and we truly look at revenues, what people paid us for, right? And
Yeah.
what we had to pay for, it gets distilled down into a really important number, which is, am I
Yeah.
generating any cash for my operations?
Hmm. And so something that you mentioned earlier is, dangerous territory is fraud. And, fraud experts and turnaround specialists are a great target audience, for your book as a reference material. But what patterns do you see as far as, companies that fall victim to fraud?
Yeah, I mean, usually there's some it doesn't always come from one department over versus the other, right? But when we
Okay.
think about some of those larger ones like the Enron fraud, which, we're still teaching to the Enron even though it happened over 20 years ago and we've started to relax some of those policies that came out after that large bankruptcy. But truthfully, right, there's always some what's the word I'm looking for? There's collusion is the word that I'm looking
Mhm.
for with accounting. So it's never one department. It generally tends to be someone in accounting.
Mm.
And it may not be that they're just stealing money from that particular business, but if you can smell opportunity and you smell this sort of lax in controls, right? Internal controls are the most important foundation to any business. And it's
Mhm.
almost secondary because a founder, right? Or an entrepreneur is thinking, I just need sales, I just need revenues. All the rest of that structure will come. By then,
Yeah.
it's too late. And I'll
Mhm.
tell you my example of the family business, the cash and transit business. This is such an extraordinary story. So 10 million of the customers' cash went missing. It actually wasn't
Mhm.
cash, it was actually coin. It was bagged coin.
Oh
So I
my
walk
God.
into the vault that they had, the family. It was an 87-year-old business. Family
Wow.
started it. They sold it for
Wow.
$1. And I walked into the vault, and bags of coin are strewn everywhere. no financial controls, not even locked up. And the third generation rolls up his sleeves and puts his feet down on the desk and says, nobody steals coin. Yes, they
Yeah,
do.
they do.
Especially when you can take it to Coinstar and they pay you 90 cents on the dollar. And
Oh
it,
my
and it
gosh.
really, they smell opportunity, right? So fraud
Yeah.
happens by knowing that the internal controls are lax, by smelling that opportunity, by understanding maybe I can get some people involved in other departments. I think accounting was involved in a little bit of that fraud,
Mhm.
although nothing that I could actually prove. They were smart enough to leave everything out of writing, which is interesting in and of itself. But usually there's always opportunity. Yeah, so fraud has been part of my DNA
Mhm.
when I first started working at KPMG. My first fraud case was Farmore, and nobody probably remembers Farmore because it doesn't exist any longer, but it was
Mm.
very similar to like a Walmart. They had
Okay.
350 stores across the country, and that was big for the early 90s.
Mhm.
Nobody had stores like that. Walmart wasn't even on the scene yet. And they sold pharmaceuticals and sundries. And the CEO partnered with the CFO and they cooked the books. They literally had two
Mhm.
sets of books. So that was my first
Wow.
exposure. And I was like, what? Who is this unethical? How does this happen? And I kid you not, Emma, we were working for the secured creditor. We'd fly into town. It was in Youngstown, Ohio. We'd go out to
Mhm.
dinner. We'd see the CEO. He'd be out with his ankle bracelet on because he was doing jail time. And he would be out at the restaurants like nothing
Oh my
ever
God,
happened.
like nothing happened.
Nothing happened. And I'm looking at him thinking the confidence that you have and the swagger
Mhm.
you have to walk around in the town that you obliterated all these people's lives, right? Because it isn't that they just ruined their own lives and he went to jail. All of
Yeah.
those people, right? I talked about the family office and the wife with four kids, but there's
Mhm.
always employees who suffer, right?
Yeah.
Their families suffer because they're going to be out of jobs when it files for bankruptcy. So there's such this trickle down effect to this mismanagement that
Yeah.
it's so egotistical, it's
Yeah.
so narcissistic. And when you have really good people, everything starts with people, always,
Yeah.
everywhere, no matter what business you have. I
Mhm.
just when you empower them with numbers and are empowered with understanding the story, they'll speak up, right?
Yeah.
They'll say
True.
something. And
Yeah.
not asking for anyone to be whistleblowers, although that's what happened in Enron, right? We ended up with a whistleblower there. And we didn't have that at the cash and transit company.
Mhm.
And there could have been because the two employees that stole the $10 million, every day they'd come to work in a brand new car.
Oh my
Whether
gosh.
it be a nice $80,000 Tesla or a brand new truck, they're posting on Facebook that they're hosting all of these parties. They made $14 an hour.
Oh my gosh. That's crazy. That
Yeah.
does not add up at all.
It does not add up, right? Two plus two is not four in that example. Something's
Yeah.
wrong. So yeah, it's very interesting and you can sense it very early on for sure.
Yeah, I bet. Is that common for, financial failure more often involving, incompetence and overconfidence and dishonesty? Does that happen a lot that you see? Or
I in my work, I would say yes, just because those are the stories that I've always gravitated towards. It doesn't happen. It's maybe 4% of the time, right?
hmm
Most people, really most human beings are ethical people. They care deeply. They're
Yeah.
emphatic humans.
Yeah.
So you've got this small population that just really
Yeah.
senses the chaos that's going on inside of a business. And
hmm
that's really the key. Even in Enron, which is so long ago, and if you try to really unwind that or unpack that largest bankruptcy in US history, they made it so complicated that even the auditors couldn't really sense what was going on. And so when somebody senses that nobody knows what's going on, you take that opportunity. And
Yeah.
there's enough people like that who eventually will just, see that opportunity instead of, saying, "Hey, there's some things we need to do here to work to make this a better place." They'll just
Yeah.
seize it and personally enrich themselves.
Yeah. And so what do you hope that readers and educators, you just anyone in general gets what mindset do you hope that they that changes or that they get out of your book?
Oh, that's such a great question. I have approached my book along with the teachings inside of it as a life skill. When
Mm-hmm.
you really can understand your financial statements, your personal financial statements, you are empowered to make decisions on your behalf. When you
Mm-hmm.
have no idea what's going on in your own personal world, I I don't know how people then can go into any other
True.
world with confidence, right?
Yeah.
So this is a life skill. I wish they would teach it a lot earlier to students. I know only business students get to take accounting classes, and I'm not saying that anyone's proficient after they take my classes or they read my book, but it does start to create that language. And when
Mm-hmm.
you have common language on empowerment and what it means, because whether you're investing in yourself, looking at your own financial statements, or you are saving for your retirement, that's going to come through your 401k. You're going to be asked to make investments and you're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to choose how you place your money. That's empowering when you can read those financial statements. Otherwise, you're checking a box going, well, I don't know, the name looks kind of interesting. I guess I'll pick that name, right? And
Yeah.
this is a life skill. I wrote the book as though you're going to gain and garner life skills out of that book. When you
Mm-hmm.
can speak this language, this accounting language, you really have armed yourself with the ability to change your financial outcome.
Mm-hmm. And what was your writing experience like, writing this book? Can you share any like anecdotes of your writing experience?
You know, I'm a storyteller by nature, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it came very rapidly and very easily, right? The foundations are already there. You know, assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. That's nothing new, and I didn't create that. And Gap will stand behind that. The actual accounting's been around since the Mesopotamic era, so it's been around for a long time. And
Mm-hmm.
nothing has changed, right?
Yeah.
Everything else in the world has changed, but accounting has never changed. That gives
Yeah.
me a lot of peace to know that, like, nothing's rapidly changing. How we
Yeah.
perform those tasks has, but what we've really done is we've sort of shifted this Bloom's taxonomy where human beings are supposed to be creators. That's all we're put on earth to do is to create. And so if we can get out of this rote memorization that leads to knowledge, I can start to free people up to become the creators that they are. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that's really
Love that.
beautiful and part of the book, which is how do I help you become that creator that you're supposed to be? I need you to have some education. I need you to have some
Yeah.
foundations. But when you're empowered with this language, you can build that confidence. And truthfully, right now we need people with a lot of confidence, but it shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be misplaced confidence.
Yeah. True. Is there a section of your book that was actually the most fun to write, or is a favorite part of your book that you like the best?
Well, I love telling my case story. So my
Mm-hmm.
opening case, even the introduction, is all written in my words, right? In the way that I speak in language. And then I sort of have
Yeah.
to get into more kind of educational type of material. But I loved being able to really kind of bring out how I teach and how I speak about this language. So my
Mm-hmm.
cases, my introduction, the meat and potatoes is unfortunately Gap and been around since the Mesopotamic era. Nothing there changes. Just a way to make it easier for that student, that lifelong learner to really understand this language.
Mm-hmm. And how is your book sort of laid out? How did you go about I guess like outlining it for readers to best understand it and to go through a sort of like a journey while reading your book?
So I wanted those hooks in there because if
Mm-hmm.
it's just finance and accounting, right,
Right.
for beginners or for intermediates, it will feel too textbooky.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
knew to draw people in, it needed more of my punch and
Yeah.
my voice in it, because otherwise accounting, just like when I teach in the classroom, right? When I'm in the classroom and people are like, wow, you make this so interesting. I really hope that
Oh.
that book reflects that same interesting
Yeah.
perspective. because
That's
I
so
got
nice.
a lot of stories, that's for sure. So I only pulled out a couple for this book. I've got
Okay.
a few still up my sleeve for the next one,
Oh,
as I think
nice.
about how that might come together. But it was interesting to your point. It was like I have this catalog of cases, right? I didn't just
Mhm.
want to write my life story. That's not
Yeah.
as interesting. Although I do think people's life stories are incredibly interesting, and I wish more people would write them, not
Hmm.
necessarily to be published, because someone in your family and you'll forget about them as you go through life,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah,
wish I
true.
can't think about any of the things that happened when I was 18. So
True.
but I knew that my catalog of work had really interesting stories in it. And I
Hmm.
didn't want to just write my life story. I knew that it was all based in this knowing your numbers, knowing your darn numbers. So how do I bring that all together in a way that feels like I'm honoring some of my cases, some of my life
Yeah.
work, but also making sure that students recognize this life skill and how important
Hmm.
that life skill is.
And did you have a difficult part of your writing process, or was it all pretty easy to get through and just write and
Yeah.
write and write?
Yes, yes. It came very natural. It was
Okay.
very in flow, if you will, right? I'd sit
Uh-huh.
down for a couple of hours and it was like, wait a minute, what happened? And how did I end up with all of these pages? This is so fabulous. And it's just because it's like ingrained inside of every vein of my body because it's been
Uh-huh.
such a
Aw.
long process of
Yeah.
loving this book that was on the shelf that, was always in sort of a manual type of, maybe a binder, a three-ring binder, and I'd pull it off, and sometimes it would just be the papers, and I was
Yeah.
like, wait, this needs to be more formalized. I just know it.
Hmm.
So how do I get it into print? And that was really fun.
And so how did it feel receiving your book for the first time and holding it and just what emotions did you have when you first saw your book for the first time?
You know, it was one of those where I think I just took a very deep sigh.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom was alive when I started writing this book. And
Mm-hmm.
my acknowledgments at the beginning, right, address my greatest accomplishments, which are my daughters, and then
Mm-hmm.
also address the fact that it's really hard to go through life without your mother's love. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think people talk about that enough. At least I didn't. I sort of just muscled through when my mom died 21 years ago. So she was part of the process of this coming out. And it was really nice to honor her in that way. And I think that was sort of
Sweet.
that breath of just going, right? There's so many measurements of success. And I think people
Mhm.
get lost with what they think truly that it's just monetary, right? And oh, do I have
Yeah.
all of the money in the world? That's what measures success. And it's really it's not that isn't what success means to me. Success means that I have touched someone's life. I've made their life just slightly easier. And if that
Mhm.
means by you reading my book and being armed with this language, this knowing your darn numbers, then I really feel like I set out to accomplish my purpose in
Oh, I
life.
love that. That's so sweet. So what has feedback been like from your book, or have you had any reviews or anything?
Yeah, and it's it's
Nice.
it's slow coming out. I haven't really kind of pushed it in a way that I feel overwhelmed. I feel like it's coming out organically, and
Hmm.
so most of the people have been people who I've worked with over the last 25 years, and people are really astounded by the writing. People
Hmm.
say things like, wow, I wish I had this earlier. I wish I, would have known about these things. So I know I'm hitting a spot that people are really enjoying, and then being able to see my personality come through it in my cases.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
that's
been a lot of
awesome.
the feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thank you.
What about like family and friends? Have they read your book or, used their book for their own personal financial decisions?
Yeah, yeah. I get a lot of people asking me questions now about, well, how do you calculate gross profit again? And it's like, okay, let's talk.
We love the
And
question.
yeah, exactly. My children, my daughters have read it. I think it takes a little bit more than one pass for them. Believe it or not, I didn't get any accountants and of children. I have an engineer, I have an architect, and a special education
Oh
teacher.
my gosh,
So they all
amazing.
stayed away from accounting, which is so funny to me. But that's okay. I'm glad that they're off doing their purpose in life,
That's
and they
awesome.
all are really productive human beings, which is all I ever strived for. Like I said, they're my
Oh,
greatest
that's
accomplishments.
sweet. That's so
Thank
sweet.
you.
What advice would you give to a writer working on their first book?
Just do it. And the hardest part is starting to get it out, right? Everybody wants to
Yeah.
write and then edit immediately. And it's
Yeah, that's
no,
true.
you've got to write, right? And then let it all sit and simmer and meld together because what you might not think might be useful in the beginning, once
Yeah.
you finish it, you go back and it all comes together. And
Yeah.
it's such a beautiful process. And you start to see that when you read other authors' books, when
Hmm.
all of a sudden the end, and you'll feel it when the book sort of ends and it
Hmm.
doesn't get brought back together. It's almost like they over edited it. And
Oh, yeah.
and you can see that they edited out things that could have maybe tied it back together. And so I just feel like just write and then
Mhm.
decide how you edit it because you never know where these branches of this tree are going to grow.
True. Yeah. Yeah. And did you mention earlier that you're working on a second book or you want to work on a second book with more case studies and things like that?
Yeah, the second book I've titled The Fixer. I feel like I've spent a lot of my life fixing everybody, whether it
Mm.
was fixing this business or fixing that business or fixing this person's life or fixing this person's, outfits or what have you. And so it
Yeah.
really became, and the family office that I talked about, that principle, I mean, talk about being a fixer. And like I said, I couldn't fix him. And it was
Mhm.
really, really traumatic for me to have gone through
Yeah.
that. So there's some honor that I need to owe there to that family. And there's a little bit about that case, that particular experience of mine that I think should be told. He
Mm.
was a unique individual, and what happened to him should not have happened. And
Yeah.
sad that it did. But I think there's a little bit more honor that I can deliver there to that family. So,
Oh, that's sweet. That's really sweet. How is it working with your publisher? And how
oh,
did you find your
fantastic.
publisher?
You know, gosh, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't even remember how I came across Archway. I
Mhm.
sometimes feel like things are messages that come from the universe somehow.
Mhm. Yeah.
Miraculously most often.
Yeah.
And so it's a division of Simon and Schuster, and most people know Simon and Schuster, right?
Mhm.
So, and then I started to explore other authors, other friends of mine who have been published. And so then I started down does this make sense? Is this the right house for me? And
Mhm.
I felt really good about that decision after having a little bit of self-reflection along with market reflection on where they place themselves in kind of
Okay.
the space. So
Okay.
um, don't remember how the sign came through, but I'm glad it
But you knew it
did.
was right. Good. Cool.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so what are your, some professional and personal goals you have for this year moving forward?
Thanks. So I think professionally, I really believe that this book has a little bit more avenues. It has a little bit more that can be scratched, if you will, with my itch.
Hmm.
Partnering with local community colleges,
Hmm.
figuring out how they're business professional institutes. You also have executive education. We usually teach accounting in all of those areas, and yet it's too focus towards being an accountant. And so this takes you out of, I don't want to be an accountant. I want to understand the language.
Yeah.
So big goal is just making sure that I can scream from the mountaintops that this is a life skill and that when we
Hmm.
have this common language, you've empowered yourself to have conversations that you never thought you could be part of. I call them fun Friday night party conversations, right? When all of a sudden you get to talk about EPS and you get to, talk about margins and things like that, right? That's not a common language that we share. And
Yeah.
when you're
Should
confident
be.
enough,
Yeah.
yes, it should be. When you're confident enough in what that language is, it's like learning any other second language. And I don't
Mhm.
speak a second language, although it is a personal goal of mine. Keep working on my Duolingo,
Oh.
but it doesn't come naturally, right? And so I really try to frame this for students and for all of those lifelong learners out there that this is a language. It takes time to master this language, but once you have it, you can't ever have it taken away.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. And
Yeah.
so your book ends with, this powerful idea that numbers don't lie, but people often do. How do you think, leaders should interpret that idea, and what lessons should they take from that?
I think it's sort of the theme of 2026, which is trust but verify.
Mm,
And we are so trusting as humans, and there's
yeah.
nothing wrong with that, right? It's so much easier to go about life when I trust people around me. I trust
Yeah,
that
it's
this is going to get
easier.
done and
Yeah.
that's going to get done. But when you've been disappointed, right, and when you've been maybe let down, it really requires us to step back and think about the logic of what that means to trust but verify. And there's easy
Mm,
ways to do it, right? That's what the book sort of suggests is we can run quick ratios to verify the information, right? Then we start to really craft this story and tie it all together. That's the verification purpose. So while the accountant's job and those people, the operations job is to put together those black and white numbers, it's
hmm
really our job to verify those numbers in a way that comes out of that book, but also makes us feel like we can trust what we're actually reading. And
hmm
that was really, that family of the cash in transit, the 87-year-old family business, not
Yeah.
one of that third generation understood their numbers. And they all said to me, I wish you would have been here, Jackie. This never would have happened had you been here. And I said,
Yeah.
you're right, it wouldn't have happened because
Yeah.
there wasn't a single internal control inside of here. And it's the most fundamental thing you can do when you set up a cash in transit business. They were moving $1 billion worth of cash and currency per year, and they had absolutely zero internal controls. None.
Crazy.
And it
Oh
was
my
all
gosh.
trust, right? They thought, oh, well, we're trusting and oh, we're trusting. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, you have to verify. And that comes from regularly scheduled meetings. And that comes from
Mhm.
really knowing what I say in that book, which is
Yeah.
understanding your darn numbers.
Yeah. And just a quick question, how long does it take for people to, or for business owners to start having that sort of um decisions about, well, making the wrong decisions, and how long does it take for it to be like an oopsie, I guess, and for it to affect like the whole business as far as like these decisions that are being made that are wrong, but how long does it like effectively like happen?
Yeah, I like to work in 90-day cycles. I think it
Okay.
generally takes about 90 days to really see an impact, good or bad, on
Yeah.
any decision that we make. And so when we sort of think about these rolling quarter forecasts and these rolling sort of ways to look at our financials, our numbers,
Yeah.
it can become evident very, it's not something that has to happen every single second of the day. We have
Yeah.
weekly dashboards that highlight, right, with some warning signals, just like you have a dashboard on your car that tells you, hey, maybe change your oil, right? That starts to
Yeah.
do the blinking, those
Okay.
weekly dashboards. Maybe we have to talk about, we have to go into operations and start thinking about maybe we have to change a supplier. Maybe the tomatoes aren't slicing well for our hamburgers, whatever it might be, right? We first get that warning signs, the flashing, just
Mhm.
like the dashboards of our car. And then after that 90 days, we don't really see it all the way cycle through those financials until about
Yeah.
90 days.
Okay. Very interesting.
Scary though, Emma, I'm just going
Yeah.
to say this out loud. There's been some talk in Congress actually about getting away from quarterly financials in the publicly traded space, which
Oh,
is shocking. Yes, I see
yeah.
your face. It is terrifying to people like me who
Yeah.
believe that it takes 90 days for us to see the reaction or the action take place. And
hmm
there's this little commentary, and I hope it
Oh,
was
boy.
nonsensical,
I hope so.
because
Yeah.
I can't imagine that companies would be in a better place, if you will,
Yeah.
by not producing those. I know investors would not be in a better place without quarterly financial information. If you're
Yeah.
just for annual by that time, game
It's,
over.
oh my gosh. Yeah. I can't imagine that. I hope that's a rumor. I hope that's not real, because yeah, that would be awful.
Yes, I
Oh my
agree.
gosh.
I'm sorry. Yes, I hope I'm not being the bearer of bad news. I don't think that the AICPA would allow it. Thankfully,
Mhm.
we have these different branches of the government, and the SEC is
Yeah.
probably far more interested in making sure that the public can trust that data, right, that comes out.
Trust.
And that's
Yeah.
that's
Good.
it's interesting to me though, right? Because really the market is a speculative. And if you read the book 1929 by Andrew Ross Sorkin, which is a great book, and it talks about the disaster in 1929, and when the
Mm.
first when the stock market was set up and right before all those crashes, it was called like a speculator's game. And
Hmm.
people are really speculating until you understand the financial information. And the reason why it was called a speculator game is because they had no financial information. So the SEC was born of the 1929 disaster when everything filed for bankruptcy and the stock market crashed. How would you take that away? That verification that you're speculating in the market that the price of that stock's going to go up. All of that market is speculation without having proper financials behind it. So
Hmm.
you can't make great, confident investment decisions if you don't have those timely financials. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how passionate you are about this. I think it's so great. When did you first know that you really wanted to dive into this career and this you mentioned earlier that you always just had that question of why when you were younger, but why this sort of career of that you chose?
Well, I think it's in the blood. So while I told you that not one of my children became an accountant, my dad was an accountant. My
Oh, okay.
grandfather was an accountant. My grandfather worked for
Oh.
Arthur Anderson, God rest their souls. Arthur Anderson died with Enron. My dad worked for the same public accounting firm that I worked for. So this lineage, right? Um,
Mhm.
but as I reflect on that, I took all of my accounting classes in the very last semester at school because I
Did you
really wanted
really?
to be a marketing major. Yes, I wanted to work in fashion so bad. So
Oh,
maybe that helps you understand why I'm so passionate about it. But
yeah.
I think over the years, it really settled on, holy cow, this is a life skill.
Yeah.
And I've got to shout this from the mountaintops. I have to tell everyone what I know. And this is my second act, right?
Hmm.
I'm not in my third act yet. I'm just in my second. And this is where I get to give back to everyone. And I think when you empower young people, whether it's, 18, 19, 25-year-olds, when they're ready
Yeah.
to accept that information, you can really set people up for success, whatever that success looks like, right? And
Hmm.
it isn't always financial, but being
Yeah.
empowered to understand this language is really big. And it's very
Yeah.
mystical to a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Everyone is
True.
like so afraid. I'm like, listen, we're not performing open heart surgery. I'm not
Yeah.
leaving any tools behind. You can make a mistake. It will fix itself.
Hmm.
That's the beauty of this. So don't be afraid, and definitely don't be afraid to ask why.
Hmm. Very cool. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we go, or do you have a website that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. www.jackiecahan.com. And that is Cahan. So it looks a little bit like Jackie Chan, but it's not. It's Jackie Cahan. And no, I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for all of your wonderful questions. They've really been
Oh,
a
thank
delight today.
you.
And I hope that everything that I've said resonates with your audience.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, and I think that this is, like you said, a life skill that I think a lot of people don't understand, and I think that it will resonate with a lot of people. And if you listening would like to purchase Jackie's book, you can head to archwaypublishing.com and purchase through the online bookstore, and you also can get it on Amazon and Barnes& and Noble. And thank you so much, Jackie, for being here.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
day,
you.
everyone.
You too.
Take
Bye.
care.